It's Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. My old friend Vamsee Juluri, the noted professor from the University of San Francisco, joins me today from his residence in San Francisco to talk about something he's been interested in, and indeed the world has been interested in the last several weeks. The completely mad and crazy California wildfires that have destroyed large parts of California, but also some of the most wealthy parts of the world, including the famous Malibu beach and beachfront homes costing tens of millions of dollars. How do we make sense of all of this, even as the US gets a new president who clearly does not believe climate change is real? To make sense of all of this, Vamsee Juluri. Vamsee, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Hindol. It's a pleasure to reconnect with you and to connect with your viewers. I follow some of the conversations in your series, so I'm really looking forward to our chat today, even though it's about a rather concerning topic.
Thank you for your time, Vamsee. Vamsee, let me begin by asking you. You wrote about this in a couple of articles, including in the Indian press, about how the California wildfires, in which thankfully you were not affected directly, but another part of California was, really was in a sense an emblem of many things that has gone wrong in uh, in American society, but perhaps also in society at large around the world. Why don't we begin there, Vamsi? Why don't you begin with that, strain of thought and talk to us a little bit about, this moment in the Anthropocene, so to speak?
Indeed. Yeah, so my good friends at the Indian Express asked me to write something about it a few weeks ago. And, coincidentally enough, I was thinking of the poetic and ominous title of James Baldwin's book, even though I had not put that title there over at the Indian Express, they actually called my piece, The Fire This Time. And, there is that sense of ominous resignation, perhaps, living in California at this time. And, this is like, it is like the last frontier. And I could really remember, in some sense, the excitement I felt when I moved to California about 20 years ago. And perhaps even before that, the excitement of leaving your motherland for the shores of the United States. This is a country in which the sense of approaching frontiers is very important. And so perhaps 100 years ago, it felt one way for the Irish and Southern European immigrants. Then perhaps in a quieter way, it felt exciting for our uncles and aunties who came here as NASA scientists and doctors in the 60s. Um, but then, in the larger scheme of things, when you look at it in the larger scheme of things, what is our place and time in history? And what I wrote in this piece essentially is perhaps an overview of the fragmented, incomplete, and often hostile nature of our understanding of our time and place in relation to nature, because I kind of described in my piece what it felt like following news of the aftermath of these fires on social media. And, you know, uh, the fact that every few seconds you would be plunged into a completely different consciousness or understanding or editorializing by different people based on what the algorithmic feeds were showing you. On the one hand, you had that sense of immersion, this urgency, because you had celebrities, who obviously have millions of followers and show up in your feed, talking about how they've left their homes, but then they're seeing through their cameras, the fire actually creeping up to their beautiful mansions up on the hills. And then you have the discourse about perhaps the impact of DEI and diversity hiring. And there was a discussion that a lot of capable firefighters gave up their jobs during the pandemic because of the whole vaccination controversy. And then there were all these promo videos that suddenly surfaced of a firefighter, seemingly smirking and saying that if a man is caught in a fire, that's his fault. So that kind of borderline contemptuousness towards certain groups of people based on their identities under the well-meaning guise of diversity and inclusion. All those, identity issues and divisions came up. But the bigger picture, as you said, is the Anthropocene. The conversation around climate change and really where we are going to go in 10 or 20 years if we continue to persist in a way of life which is on the one hand confined um, by this um, one life to live. Nature is just a commodity to be exploited. It's just a machine, which has been caught up with this frontier mentality. So I wish we could find the excitement of having a frontier culture, but not in this old colonial or anthropocentric sense. So those are some of my abstract theoretical concerns, but more concretely, there is that sense that you're living in a beautiful place here, but you never know what disaster will strike next.
Let's talk a little bit about actually what really happened, Vamsi. I mean, these fires are not new. This time, of course, the fires seem to have been far more wild in a sense than ever before. But this has been happening again and again in the Californian bush, so to speak. And this time, of course, it really affected lots of residential areas, including the homes and mansions, as you said, of the very, very wealthy. The image of gutted Malibu beachfronts is something which is quite devastating and strange for many people around the world. But living there, even though you were not directly impacted, living there, talk to us a little bit about what you went through. I mean, one is, of course, what was happening on your phone or maybe on your television set, but actually living there on the street or, on the roads with your neighbors at your university. What was the mood like? What did you feel? What were people saying?
So, this time, excuse me, the mood is always of caution, especially when something happens anywhere in California. The mood is of caution, and I can quickly recap all the times we heaved a sigh of relief. Right here in the Bay Area as well. I think the first time in recent memory that we really had an environmental concern was around 2018, perhaps. I think this was one of the fires which took place. Perhaps I think this was a fire which took place, which in Napa, the famous wine country, which is not too far from San Francisco, and the smoke was so bad. I remember that was the first time, even before the pandemic, the university had to close down and switches to these Zoom classes. And for 2 or 3 days, the Bay Area kind of came to a halt because the air quality was just so bad. And then the university essentially issued a policy about what we were going to do whenever there were fires. So since then, this kind of global reality that even if the fire is not in your backyard, you might get impacted by it. That became a reality. Then again in 2020, at the peak of the pandemic, in September, we had a very strange situation where, again, there were electricity-based fires. I think this was, again, in rural California, about an hour or two away from us. But that time, the smoke and the fog and the smog all settled into some kind of, really eerie spectacle. That morning we got up, it was about 9 a.m. or 10 a.m., and it's still pitch dark. And usually in September, because it's fall, the sky is bright blue and it's beautiful. But for that whole day, it was pitch black. It was, scary. And then the air was so horrible. So for at least 2 or 3 days, everyone had to be indoors. And so if you've seen movies like Blade Runner, it really, you were living inside that nightmare for a few days. And then inside the Bay Area, at least 2 or 3 times in the last couple of years, we've seen fires break out. And so the first thing that happens is, you try and check with people who might be in the area um, about one's safety. And every time that happens, sometimes we actually watch. Sometimes if you can see a fire breaking out somewhere, You're cautiously just watching through the window to see if it's spreading or it's being controlled. And you try and remember what are the things you need to take in case you are asked to evacuate. So these are some of the concerns we have. Now, as far as this particular fire was concerned, I mean, I asked my students, as of now, I don't believe anybody was affected, fortunately. But yeah, I think the broader issue that is on a lot of people's minds is whether we are competent. I mean, at one level, remember, they used to call these acts of God in the insurance lingo. But um, why has our discourse and our understanding, our ability to manage this suffered so much? And let me give you one anecdote actually in terms of a real life situation. So over the years, one of the things we've noticed in the Bay Area is in terms of one particular risk or challenge, okay, not the broader issue of climate change and climate change denial and so on. There's a one concrete issue that comes up very often is what do we do with, like as you said, the dry bush? There's a lot of dry trees, there's a lot of non-local, what's it called, invasive species, right? So huge eucalyptus trees, groves here and there, and a lot of trees which have dry up during the summer and a lot of dry grass. So what's been happening is typically in many apartment complexes, residential colonies, and so on, there's always been this sort of debate or tussle between privacy and views. Okay. So I'm sure like the multimillionaire celebrities in Southern California bought those homes partly for the views because you're on a hill and you can see into the ocean. And so even in the Bay Area, a lot of people like to have a bit of a view because it is very, very hilly. A bit like Vishakhapatnam, so to give a home state reference. And then what happens is you pay a lot of money for a view, and then you have your trees, but then you have other people who want the trees there because they want privacy. So that used to be the deciding factor. But in the last 5 or 10 years, fire concerns have become very big. So you do have city officials. Like I remember about a year ago, I think some of the city officials came around to our colony and our HOA board members. They took them around and they cut a lot of seemingly dried or trees and shrubs. But then there are these huge forests still of eucalyptus trees. And then ultimately the houses are made of wood here, as opposed to back in India where the aesthetics may not be much, but at least it's cement, for better or for worse. I think that is one issue that there is a sense of lack about forest management, fire management, and things. And of course, a broader issue, which I was concerned with in my article as well, is the conflation of the local and global in very bizarre ways. So, like in California politics, especially if you're a local politician, if you're running for a position of, say, your city council or something like that, shouldn't your priorities be local issues like fire safety or traffic lights and things like that, instead of Gaza, Palestine, or India Citizenship Amendment Act, or the alleged caste outbreak in India and so on. So this is something I found very strange, where I think people have forgotten that when you engage in a civic manner, when you engage in local politics, the whole enlightenment public sphere thing, there is a time and place for global issues, and there is a time and place for local issues like the fire breathing down your neck from your backyard.
Let me
And
ask you
that I
this,
think,
Vamsee. One of the things that came out in this conversation was that exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about, whether these kind of ideas seeped into local politics, actually even seeped into conservation ideas. And whereas a lot of the shrubs should have actually been cut, or a lot of the fires should have, in a particular process of contained fires, should have taken care of, that for many years wasn't done, which allowed the sort of flora and fauna to grow in a particular manner because they were not contained and contained fires were not done. when the outbreak happened, it was a huge outbreak, and there's a lot of quarreling between the Democrats and the Republicans about this, especially after the coming of the Trump administration, because President Trump has clearly said that this is one of the failures of the California state to not being able to do this and do this effectively because of the kind of concerns, including DEI concerns that you're
Mhm.
pointing out. How far is this correct?
Well, so again, the discourse has become so uh, stymied in a way that it's become one ends up instinctively looking over one's shoulder before answering any kind of a political question. But since I tend to, I think, hopefully be fair about criticizing things on both sides. Well, see, the position on the Republican side, in a sense, the Republicans, I mean, typically have lacked sophistication or clarity. At least, I would say, as far as I knew, for 20, 30 years, the Republicans were associated with a kind of lumbering, approach to everything driven by money. And the Democrats traditionally were seen as the people, the hope of the little guy, and concerns like the environment and so on. But post-Iraq war, starting, I think, from the time of the Obama government, there has been a huge left-right shift. I'm almost tempted to call it a swap in American discourse. And as a result of that, you find something lacking on both sides. So let me be equally fair in criticizing both sides. On the Republican side, well, um, more than President Trump, I would say a certain kind of a worldview is on an ideology or a manifesto um, making. It has been going on mostly in the form of Vivek Ramaswamy, whose earlier book Woke Inc. I found very interesting. I mean, to a certain extent, it was a kind of thing a left progressive professor who could have written 20 years ago criticizing Wall Street and its appropriation of these social justice slogans. In his new book, Truths, Vivek Ramaswamy makes this distinction. He says the issue is not that climate change is false or something like that. It is more like what he calls the climate change agenda, the way it has sort of been proposed as this soundbite, which seemingly explains everything, including immigration and all kinds of issues. So I don't know exactly what the nuances and the blame apportioning should be on this. But on the Democratic side, I would say locally, um, it's I have to say that over the last 10, 15 years, you do see how dysfunctional things are. And I mean, one can talk about Republican dysfunctionality too. It's just that in California, we have suffered from the Democratic side of it a lot more. And so as a result, I think there's almost this la la land magical approach to things where I think people seem to believe that as long as you're chanting the right slogans, you're purchasing the right indulgences, as they used to be called, and you talk about climate change and diversity and carbon offsets and whatnot, then everything is going to be all fine. And one of the questions I recall asking my students a few months ago is I said, how many of you have not seen a burglary or car break-in or some kind of a small crime like that in the last few years? And very few hands went up. So this kind of safety has become a big issue, I think, in California, particularly in the Bay Area. And I should mention this book. Um, so I mentioned this in my article as well. So Michael Schellenberger, San Francisco, Why Progressives Ruin Cities. So I think he represents a certain constituency now, which was not traditionally Republican or right wing at all. These are many, many people who are liberal, but I think who now kind of feel completely unheard and unrepresented by the Democratic Party.
You
And
mentioned
that.
that, Vamsi, because I wanted to ask you this question. For many
Mhm.
people who are listening to you around the world, and certainly me sitting in India, for many of us, when we look at what's going on in San Francisco and in California, it's a bit. it's a bit strange to say the least, because on one hand, here is this great engine of growth, right? I mean, some of the best technology in the world, some of the best minds ostensibly in the world, extremely powerful corporations, willing to donate billions of dollars for quote unquote the greater public good. And yet, somehow, I mean, it's a bit like Bombay, isn't it, Vamsi? You're some of the most powerful people and wealthy people in India living in Mumbai, and yet it is one of the most dysfunctional cities in the world. San Francisco increasingly seems a bit like that. I mean, you have some of the most powerful, wealthy, and ostensibly intelligent and smart people who can fix all kinds of things, or at least who profess that they can fix all kinds of things, including, global poverty and disease and hunger and all kinds of things. But they can't seem to fix their own city. Increasingly over the last 10 years, property prices, constant conversation about, California and San Francisco, homelessness, opioid crisis, and now, of course, this terrible thing in wildfires. All of this is a very volatile mix, and I wonder whether you could reflect on why this almost this unnatural bringing together of some of the smartest people in the world and wealthiest people in the world still somehow cannot fix their own city, even though they clearly have the brains and the money to fix many other things around the world.
Oh, a very apt question. See, when I moved here in 2001, we had a crisis in just 2 or 3 months, and that was the 9/11 attacks. And on the one hand, yes, there was a sense of fear here as well. But at the same time, one also felt a little comforted that this was a place where generally people don't stare at you if you're a foreigner and things like that. As opposed to some other parts where, one at least 20, 30 years ago, and maybe it's different now, but certainly when I was a student, I think, I stuck out. And on that note, I should also perhaps use this conversation to just mention that because soon after or around the time of the fires, maybe a week or so earlier, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit to this point. You recall there was this big controversy about Indian immigrants and H-1B visa workers and things like that, which led to this eruption of xenophobia and hatred and things like that. So I wanted to just use this platform to kind of say that, particularly for parents of Indian students or even workers who are here, I think this is, first of all, a good time to really understand our place in things, not just in a political or sociological sense, but both in a larger cosmic and ecological sense. What are we doing here as Indians? What is it about all the forces, all the causes and effects in history, all the sacrifices made by parents that have brought many of us to this country and particularly to these shores? And in a sense, we are powerless. We are privileged somewhat. I mean, in that sense of having good jobs or comfortable middle class lives or whatever. But despite the handfuls of CEOs and billionaires of Indian descent here, we are largely powerless. We tend to just go along with whatever is the norm over here. So I think what has been happening is that we have forgotten, in a sense, to wonder and contemplate the causes and effects of why we are brought here. And I screened the movie Kantara for my students in my Indian cinema class 2 days ago, and people were naturally spellbound and they were stunned. And, I think there was nothing like that they ever saw before. So in a sense, I mean, I'm leading up to something that may seem very Indian or Hindu in a very hidebound sense, as some people may think, or it may sound very Lala in a California sense, but I hope the truth is somewhere in between. And that is, where are the gods here? Or to be more precise, where are the devotions? Where is the attention that the people here living here today are
It's in the
devoting
pursuit
to?
of technology, isn't it, Vamsi? I mean, tech is the god of California. It's in the pursuit of the idea that the human mind can invent any technology. It's that old saying, isn't it, Vamsi, that any technology that your brain cannot fathom how it works is indistinguishable from magic, right? And this is and when you ask where are the gods here, well, surely the gods in California are in technology. At least that's what most people there seem to believe. But clearly, I come back to that point again. it's not helping their own city.
It did, exactly. So what I mean is, I'm almost compelled to now go into this idea of a false god, which we don't typically have in our traditions. Uh, but let's just say the gods of distraction are like minor gods. And ultimately, who's the god that is demanding to be, not, well, demanding sounds harsh, but what is our debt? What is the zone of our debt that has been neglected? And see, I was reminded of David Frawley's wonderful book, When These Fires Happened, Yoga and the Sacred Fire. And it's a wonderful combination of, environmental history, world religions, Ayurveda, and a very simple common sense idea of balance. And I think the crisis in California is that it has always had this larger tugs in opposite directions. So, in a way, it seems to me that the question of the future of India's place in the world, the question of the balance between the past and the future, the different directions like left and right in the United States, which are clearly now all mixed up, and ultimately whether human beings are going to be happy or continue to be destructive, stuck in the worship of technology and money and ego and things like that. I think those choices are going to end up get played out here because, as you pointed out, Hindol, like I think in California, it's literally like you see the world's mind being shaped by the two sides of California. So you have Hollywood and the film industry, which has sold the American dream for the last 100 years, and it has done so again with a little help from Washington, a little help from Pentagon, and all through the 50s and 60s, film historians talk about Jack Valenti and books like How to Read Donald Duck in Latin America, which talk about Hollywood soft power essentially not being a benign thing, but going hand in hand with the American hard power with the military. So you have Hollywood selling the American dream to the whole world. You have Silicon Valley essentially creating the technology and injecting our addiction to making us even more addicted to these dreams through a technology which at least 100 years ago it was still cinema. Once a week you went in for 3 hours, maybe it lingered for a few days in your mind. But now you have this situation where every few seconds your worldview changes. Teenagers are having mental health crises, as Jonathan Haidt has written. So um, I wanted to actually reflect on Amitav Ghosh's interview on climate change, which I saw recently, and he was talking about how he was saying something which neither the left nor right in America might really agree with off the bat, but I think what he said was interesting. He says there's a lot of propaganda that's driving this all these population shifts. In a sense, it is this desperation and obsession about the American dream, and it's not just this romantic idea of floods and pestilence causing people to be wash up on these shores. So, in that sense, I think what has happened is California needs to question, needs to become accountable for privilege, as they say, and it has the privilege of shaping the minds and hearts of people around the world. And what are the stories California is telling people everywhere? And I think what I'll mark the two tendencies. Very close to my campus is the Vedanta Society. There are buildings associated with, well, the subject of one of your books, I think. So, the modern monk. So, from the time of Swami Vivekananda, I'm seeing these two contradictory tendencies in America and particularly in California's approach or relationship to us, the people who were born in the subcontinent, or our ancestral traditions. So, from Vivekananda 100+ years ago to a small situation like my students witnessing the power of Panjurli, you know, and Golika in Kantara in a classroom in our beautiful campus here. What's been happening between our gods, our gurus, our traditions, and the people who happen to be living here? So I'm looking at two or three moments in the last 100 or 150 years. One, there is this tendency towards really understanding our place in the cosmos, in nature, in time, in generations, to the elements like fire and water, for example. Largely, and that is necessary because a lot of the local indigenous traditions, even though there are still Native American people who are trying to revive their lives and their ways of doing things. It's not really happened on a big scale. And so there is this tendency towards, you know, broadening one's understanding beyond technology and anthropocentrism and arrogance. But at the same time, there's a backlash to it. So the Vivekananda comes, and then a few years later, there are these anti-Hindu riots, which are documented. And then there's eugenics, and then there's Catherine Mayo's book Mother India, which completely demonizes Hinduism and in a very, very powerful way for 20, 30 years. Then in the 60s, again, you have the whole hippie revival, the Beats first, the Beats from San Francisco, Allen Ginsberg and others. And then you have the hippies in the 60s, the counterculture. And you run into people here. Every other person seems to have had a mother or grandmother or grandfather who went to India barefoot and went to the Kumbh Mela then, or Banaras, or, so the Indian spirituality was a part of California's making, particularly in the 60s. And then again, there's a backlash. There is books like Karma Cola, which is well written, but then again becomes a part of this very clever move in the 70s and 80s, where the West sort of pushes Indians and our traditions and our sense of balance away and just takes parts of yoga, parts of Ayurveda, packages it, makes a lot of money with it. And then the last 10, 20 years, you have the most organized propaganda against us that I can think of in the, using phones, using media, using celebrity like Oprah Winfrey and Pulitzer Prize writers like Isabel Wilkerson, which is so hostile, which is purporting to recast us as these fascists, who have nothing to give to the world. Whereas the simple truth is, if you just look at everybody around us, whether they've come from the continent of Africa or South Asia or, the Americas, we are simply still carrying on the oldest uninterrupted memory of what it was like when human beings lived in surrender to nature, 2 or 3 thousand years ago. And we have Hindu temples here, in California, where they do yagnas. I remember when there was a drought in California in 2014, some of the people I knew organized a huge yagnam, and I remember that started pouring. It started raining, and it was strangely enough the time my father passed away. And as the plane was leaving San Francisco, I was suddenly thinking, "Oh my God, this guy was saying he's doing yagna for rains, and now suddenly it pours for the next 2, 3 months." So I think there is something that is calling us from nature. And I think California is a place where people are inclined to listen, but they have been distracted by all these phony, literally political slogans and gimmicks. So my hope is we get beyond the worship of tech, as you rightly put it, the chanting of these platitudes and slogans about faraway issues with limited understanding. Like for example, um, the schools in California were closing down, in San Francisco were closing down last semester. I was listening to these hearings, and the parents are talking, the teachers are talking, and then suddenly these professional activists come, they identify themselves as part of this group or that group, and then they all talk about the Zionist, quote unquote, lobby in the classroom. And I was just thinking, there's no classroom left, you guys, and you're talking about, some, Israeli point of view being taught here. So I think that is the problem here. People's minds have been captured by politics becoming religion, tech becoming religion. And where is this reality that when you see your elders, when you see your children, when you see your own bodies in front of you, we are made up of these elements. We are inside what is on the outside. So California is where I think the great adventures of consciousness, the great choices of culture will have to be made now by
That's a
Indians.
fantastic. That's a fantastic, semi-last note to end this conversation, Vamsi, because I must ask you that, there is, and I think many Indians, and not just Indian, many people understand this, that there is no development possible without simultaneous enlightenment. You cannot
Yes.
materially progress and continue to materially progress unless what is inside also changes. Your
Mhm,
external
mhm.
and internal must progress in tandem. And obviously, one of the problems we face today is that our external is changing so rapidly that our internal is so static at a level that there is great cognitive and other kinds of dissonance between the two. And this is the story you're also telling about what's happening in California. And I agree with you. I think many of the technologies of the future, not just of the outside, but also of the inside, must come from places like California, like Bangalore, and so on and so forth, where a lot of the cutting edge thinking is happening, but mostly focused at the moment on the outside. But it should also move into thinking about the inside. My last question, then, Vamsi, as you look at California today, after being a resident there for about 2 decades or so, um, do you feel optimistic or do you feel pessimistic? Are you filled with hope or hopelessness with what you see around you?
I would say it's hope. And and of course, it's just that this particular conversation, this I don't know, this maybe it's just the joy of friendship of us connecting through technology, as it were, but stimulating a particular attitude. I think for both of us, we share the hope that words, when they occur, when they leave our lips or our typing fingers, and somehow you sense, and for a second you say, "Oh my God, how did it come together so well?" Most of the time, I'm floundering about, and then you suddenly recognize that we are not the actors. Na hum karta as well, sirf, I'm using a little everyday Hindi, sirf Hari does it, right? Not us. So we are not the actors. In fact, when I was a child, my mother used to take me to see these wonderful Surabhi street, theaters where they would do mythological plays all night, the Maya Bazaar and so on. And before the stage opens, there's that slow saying, now, we don't do anything, Hari does everything. And in that sense, whatever it is, like the best of times and worst of times, we are witnessing that globally with the advent of technology, with the rise of India in terms of the GDP, the economic growth, all those things. And it is also the worst of times, because I'm very aware, because I'm blessed to stay very much in touch with India. As an academic, I come every year, get my sabbaticals and things. So, coming and staying for the long stretches very, very frequently, I can see on the one hand, there is that warmth and that humanity and the joy of life that still seems so intense back home. And at the same time, it is very, very frightening. Like the fires in California, there are the fumes in India. I mean, the construction in Pune, which has sort of become my home now in India, it wasn't like that even 10 or 15 years ago. There's so much debris and cement dust from all the bulldozing. I mean, they built a shopping mall, and a few years ago, they tear the whole thing down. Why? So I think there is that kind of insane plummeting into environmental destruction that is happening on the one hand, but on the other hand, you have this inner yearning. People are telling amazing stories. They're using technology to share these stories. So what I would urge us to do is, wherever you are, um, start paying attention to the world around you, physically, because I think in India, one of the crises we have, as compared to California, is, you see, in California, one of the things I really admire is when you're driving around San Francisco, you're walking in the neighborhoods around my college and so on, you realize it looks pretty much like it did 100 years ago or 50 years ago. I mean, the wonderful Victorian homes where the Grateful Dead or Janis Joplin and Country Joe and all lived, they're still there, in Haight-Ashbury and so on. The parks are still there, the trees are there, and you wonder, oh, is this where George Harrison sang Hare Krishna under this tree 50, 60 years ago? Whereas in Hyderabad, my hometown, or even in Pune and Bangalore and so on, you see, and I'm sure it's the case in Calcutta too, things have changed so fast. So human beings, just imagine a bird who loses its home when its tree is cut down. We are also like that, because we are comforted by, maybe losing an old home or an old little garden, but then we say, okay, we have a new flat, and we have some money to buy a phone and a computer with. We forget what it has taken away from us. So in California, I think great choices are going to have to be made, whether people are going to listen to nature. Are they going to listen to their inner yearnings, or are they going to impose this kind of top-down ideology, which again, I hate to say this, but it's the Washington, D.C. ideology. Maybe 100 years ago, I would have called it the London ideology. Admiration for all things Anglo and Shakespeare and the Beatles aside. That was the imperialist ideology, capital 100 years ago. Today, it is still Washington, D.C. in many ways, but of course, there has been an enormous change, and you have the amazing, amazing, incredible sight of a person who says Hare Krishna, Tulsi Gabbard, yesterday standing up in that hearing, or not standing, I mean, well, standing up, even though she was sitting down, and essentially saying, like, look, this anti-Hindu BS has to stop. This way of doing things, of colonizing the world, has to stop. So I am hopeful that despite this unbelievable spectacle of a seemingly, xenophobic far-right party or group coming into power, there are people, there are human beings who are listening to each other, to nature, to the names of the gods, to the songs of the gods, most of all. So I have hope still in California. And believe me, if you were in my class 2 days ago, with my 25 students, the way they looked when Rishabh Shetty finished his an amazing, amazing performance at the end, it was no different from the way an audience in India would look. So I think culture can bring us together. Indian storytelling, California technology, and the inspiration of being in California. So I think California Sanatana Dharma is just, waiting to be sung. I mean, the hippies started it in the 60s. I think there's another generation now, Indian, non-Indian, Native American, whoever, all these forms of bhakti and adoration for nature, the gods of nature, I think can and will happen, and California is still a promised land.
We'll have to leave it at that, Vamsee. Thanks very much on that hopeful note. Thanks very much for your time and talking to me from California. Best of luck to you and your students, and may you remain safe from these terrible wildfires and other natural disasters. Thanks again for your time, and I'm sure we will have an opportunity to talk to you once again as, of course, the story of the Anthropocene develops. Vamsee Juluri from San Francisco, thanks very much.
Thank you, Hindol.